In 2002, in the Beta-Genet region of Ethiopia, a 12-year-old girl was taken. She was walking home from school when 7 men grabbed her. They held her for 7 days, trying to force a marriage she had not agreed to and could not refuse. This practice, the abduction of girls for forced marriage, was not unusual in the region. Most girls who were taken did not come back the way they left. On the 7th day, the men were moving her through the forest when something stepped out of the trees. 4 lions, full grown, they placed themselves between the girl and the men, and they did not move. The men ran. The lions stayed. Ethiopian police and her family found her half a day later. She was sitting in the forest, unharmed, with 4 lions circling her. When the search party arrived, the lions looked at them, turned, and walked back into the trees. A wildlife expert named Stuart Williams, who was consulted afterward, offered one explanation. He suggested the girls' crying may have sounded similar to the sound of a lion cub in distress. The lions, he proposed, may have responded to something that felt like one of their own. That explanation has been repeated many times since, but has never quite settled the question it was meant to answer. Because lions don't just protect, lions also eat, and for 7 hours in that forest they did neither. Let's be careful here, because this is the kind of story that invites the wrong kind of thinking almost immediately. The easy version is, the lions understood what was happening, they recognized injustice, they chose to help. That version feels good, it also has no scientific support. But the harder version, the one that stays with researchers who study animal behavior, isn't that the lions were moral. It's that something in those animals responded to that specific situation in a way that their biology was never supposed to produce. And that response, whatever it was, kept a child alive. The question isn't whether lions have ethics. The question is what was actually happening inside those animals. And the answer, when you follow the research carefully, is stranger and more uncomfortable than either the romantic version or the dismissive one. Start with what we know about lion behavior around distress signals. Lions are extraordinarily sensitive to vocalization. Their social structure, a pride, depends on sound. Cubs communicate distress to mothers with specific, high-frequency cries. Adult females respond to those cries with speed and aggression that researchers describe as nearly automatic. The neural pathway between cub distress sound and protective response in a lion is one of the most hardwired behavioral sequences the species. Now, a child crying under extreme fear produces sounds in a frequency range that overlaps significantly with the distress calls of large mammal young. This is not a coincidence. Human infants and the young of other social mammals evolved within the same acoustic environment. The sounds that signal vulnerability and distress converge across species in ways that are consistent enough to have been documented across multiple research contexts. What Stuart Williams was suggesting, that the lions may have heard something that felt like a cub, is not a poetic interpretation, it is a neurological one. A sound reached those animals that their brains were built to respond to, and the response their brains produced was, protect. The men, by contrast, produced a different set of signals. Movement toward the girl. Sounds consistent with threat or pursuit. The lion's threat assessment system, running in parallel with the protective response, would have flagged the men as the source of danger. So the behavior has a biological scaffold, a framework that makes it not random. But here is where it gets harder to explain cleanly. Because the Ethiopia case is not alone, and the others don't fit the distress sound explanation as neatly. In 2005, in Taronga Zoo in Sydney, a female gorilla named Jimani was observed carrying a young rabbit around the enclosure for hours. Not eating it, carrying it. In the way gorillas groom each other, the rabbit was, by any reasonable classification, prey. Jimani treated it as something else entirely. In Kenya, wildlife researchers documented a lioness, not the same pride, a different animal entirely, who adopted a baby oryx. An oryx is a primary prey species for lions. She protected it from other predators, including members of her own pride, for weeks. When the oryx eventually died, she found another one and did the same thing, then another. She did this 6 times before researchers lost track of her. In each case, the adopted animal was young. In each case, the adopting animal was female. In each case, the behavior looked identical to maternal care, the same postures, the same protective responses. The same tolerance of proximity that would normally be impossible between predator and prey. The distress sound hypothesis explains some of this. Young animals produce sounds that trigger maternal responses in unrelated females. This has been documented in dozens of species. The phenomenon has a name, alloparenting, and in social species it serves a real evolutionary function. Females who care for young they didn't give birth to help their genetic relatives survive. But the lioness in Kenya wasn't protecting a relative, she was protecting her food source. She was, by any measure of evolutionary logic, working directly against her own interests, and she did it 6 times. Here is the thing about evolutionary logic that is easy to forget. Evolution doesn't produce perfect machines. It produces animals that are good enough to survive in the environments they evolved in. The behaviors that get built into a nervous system are the ones that worked, on average, over millions of years, in a specific set of conditions. When those conditions change, when an oryx calf produces a sound, or makes a movement, or occupies a posture that overlaps closely enough with the neural template for my offspring in distress, the system fires, not because the animal has made an error. Because the system was never built to distinguish between every possible scenario. It was built to respond fast to the signals that mattered most. What we're watching when a lioness adopts an oryx isn't a moral decision. It isn't confusion, it is a system responding to inputs it was designed to respond to, in a situation that system was never designed for. And that gap, between what the system was built for and what the situation actually is where something that looks a great deal like compassion lives. Whether it is compassion is a question the data cannot answer. Whether it produces the same outcome as compassion, protection, care, safety for an animal that would otherwise die, is not a question at all. Back to the forest in Ethiopia. The girl sat with 4 lions for 7 hours. They didn't hurt her. They didn't leave her. When the people who were searching for her arrived, the lions assessed them, probably for the same signals they'd assessed the men who had taken her, found something different, and walked away. What was happening inside those animals during those 7 hours is not something any researcher can reach. The neural activity, the competing drives, the thing that kept the protective response dominant over the predatory one for that long, in that specific situation, that's beyond what the current science can map. What the science can say is this: those lions were not acting randomly. They were responding to something real in the situation, sounds, postures, signals, with responses that their nervous systems were built to produce. The outcome looked like a choice. It may have felt like something to the animals involved. It almost certainly saved a child's life. Whether that constitutes understanding or compassion, or something else that doesn't have a name yet, is a question that researchers who study this most carefully tend to hold open. There is a version of this that is easy to dismiss. Animals are not moral agents. They don't make ethical decisions. What looks like protection is stimulus and response, nothing more. That version is probably correct as far as it goes. But it doesn't go very far. Because what it can account for is the consistency. The lioness who adopted 6 prey animals over years, the gorilla who groomed a rabbit, the 4 lions who sat with a frightened child in the dark for 7 hours. Stimulus and response explains a single event. It starts to strain when the same response appears across different animals, different species, different continents, in situations that evolution had no reason to prepare for. At some point, the question stops being whether these animals are moral, and it becomes something harder, something we don't have clean language for yet. What kind of thing is an animal that protects what it should, by every law of its own nature, consume? What kind of thing is an animal that sits in the dark with a frightened child it has no reason to recognize, no reason to care about, no reason to keep safe, and keeps her safe anyway? We don't know what to call that, we may not need to. The girl came home.